All right. Welcome back, everybody. Mr. Norell here for our next module in music theory. Hope you're having a good start to your week. We're coming up on the end of this first chapter. We're going to kind of wrap things up today, and then we'll talk about the game plan for homework, as well as the end of this quote-unquote period in music, or in our class, I should say. We will have a little assessment, let's call it, not a quiz, not a test, not a tiz, not a quest, a little something just to kind of make sure we understand some of these basic concepts, because a lot of this stuff you got to kind of be rapid fire with as we go forward. Because let's be honest, if you can't read a staff, if you don't know the difference between a half note and a quarter note, or what a dynamic marking is, it's gonna be a little harder when we start to write actual chords and chord progressions and scales and all that fun stuff that's coming in the next couple of chapters. So let's dive into things today and talk a little bit about some options here. I apologize for these pop-ups. We're going to start talking about a couple little options, little things that we use in music. I like to call them options because they don't always show up. They're not mandatory for music like a note or a rest or even dynamic markings are, or time signatures and all that other stuff that we were talking about last class. So when dealing with repeats, and this is our final section of our chapter here, a repeat is a musical symbol that is used to tell the musicians to replay a section of the piece. Now, you may say, oh, Mr. Elwood, why are we doing this? Because honestly, repeats are, number one, for some people, a little confusing, if I'm honest. They are also not always seen by every type of ensemble. For example, your experience if you're a chorus person with respect to repeats might be different than if you were an orchestra person or a band person. So we want to kind of share each other's worlds a little bit, see what each other have come across. We're going to talk about bowing at the end of this chapter, which is something I'm sure the chorus and the band folks are not even remotely used to seeing. So again, to really be true composers of music, we should have a basic understanding of these things. So repeat signs basically come in two different sections or two different ways. We can either repeat something very simply, or we can get a little bit more complicated with what we repeat and how we kind of end the repeat and so on and so forth. So a simple repeat is just these two dots that you see here in the notes. It's just these basically like a final bar line with two colons that just tell us to basically like bumper bowling. Have you ever gone bumper bowling? Either pre or post COVID, where you play into the measure, you hit the repeat, and you go back. All right, it means that we just go back, we replay everything a second time. It sounds exactly the same as the first time we played it. The only difference is we're playing it a second time. And once we play it a second time, we would then continue on with the rest of the song. It's super, super easy. There's a wonderful link here in your notes. I would encourage you to take a moment right now and please go check this out. All right, so now that you're back and we happen to see that. So here's my simple repeat written on a very simple piece of rhythm staff. So we're going to start with a half note, another half note. We're going to play into this second measure here, play this third measure here, all right, and then we're going to repeat back. So if I'll tap it out as I kind of point to where we're going. So we have our tempo will be 1, 2, 3, 4. So boom, 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 boom. Repeat. Boom, 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 boom. Now go on. Boom. There you get it? All right, so that's basically it. Very simple, very basic, nothing too crazy. All right, they could be a couple of measures like we have here. We have basically 3 measures worth of music, or they could be 4 or 8 measures or even more. There really is no limit, although it would be kind of silly to have one big repeat for the whole entire song. We have a special way of doing that, which we'll get to in a little bit. If the song only has one repeat sign, so let's say that this first repeat sign between the first and second measure, let's pretend this wasn't here. So we play this measure, and then we go into the second and third measure and fourth measure, and then we come to this repeat sign, which is pushing us, the 2 dots are here, so it's pushing us back this way. We would keep going all the way back until we got to the beginning of the song. All right, so if this repeat sign isn't there, if you only have one repeat sign, it means go back to the very beginning. And typically this would happen in like the first maybe 4 or 8 measures of a piece to get us back to the beginning, replay that section, and then go on with the rest of the song. Simple repeats sound the same both times. That's important to know, maybe for a test or quiz in the future. All right, our other type of repeats, multiple ending repeats. All right, these are the ones that make use of what are called volta brackets. All right, and volta brackets are literally these little houses with the 1 and the 2 in it. And the only difference between these and simple repeats is that they're going to have a slightly different ending. So a composer would use this when they wanted to put a little bit of a different spin on the end. All right, so typically, let's say our piece is broken into like 8 measures or 16 measure phrases. At the end of that phrase, we would have the first ending and the second ending. Now, it could be 1 measure, it could be the first ending could be 2 or 3 measures, or even 4 measures long. Whatever it is for the first measure would be the same for the second. So if the first ending is 4 measures long, the second ending typically would also be 4 measures long. In my example here, the second ending is actually also the end of the piece. But just note that in music, it doesn't have to be that way. We could have 20 measures or 50 measures or 60 measures or 100 measures after the second ending. All right, it doesn't have to be at the end of the piece like it is here. I'm just doing this to keep this short and simple. So the volta bracket basically means that we're going to start playing, right? And we're going to play the first measure, we're going to play the second measure, the third measure, and we're going to play into the first ending. Then we are going to repeat back to the repeat sign. Now, if there is no repeat sign, just like with the simple repeats, we would go back to the beginning of the song. Wherever we go back to, we're going to start playing that section of music for a second time. This is where it kind of sounds the same. However, when we finish this third measure in my example, and we get to the first ending, we're going to skip it. And we're going to go directly to the second ending. And you're probably familiar with this and seeing this in church music, in the missalette and things, when you go to Sunday Mass. We see these repeats a lot in our church music. We see it a lot in modern music, in all of our chorus, band, and orchestra music. These are fairly common. But you'd be surprised how many folks get a little confused by them. So why we point them out. And then finally, the player continues on with the rest of the song, like I said before. In this particular example, I have a final bar line after the second ending, but you could have many measures that come afterwards. All right, let's talk about what happens if we want to repeat a larger section of music. So these first two examples that you saw, the simple and the multiple ending repeats, these are great if we want to do 8 measures, 4 measures, maybe even 16 measures. But anything more than that, we're probably not going to want to use these sorts of repeats, especially if we're talking about repeating, almost the whole entire piece. All right, it'd be kind of silly, kind of difficult to use a simple repeat for an entire piece of music, or a multiple ending repeat for an entire piece of music. So over the years, since about 1600 or so, we've been developing the written music of our culture. And we've decided and we've kind of evolved into using something different. And we call these larger sectional repeats. So larger repeats are used to replay huge chunks of a piece, like 20, 30, 40 measures or so. And they're basically going to, just like repeats, they're going to tell us two things. Our larger repeats are going to tell us where do we have to go back to. In other words, after I play it the first time, where am I going back? And more importantly, where am I going to stop? All right, how is this going to end? Because typically these larger repeats, when we're done repeating, we're going to be at the end of the piece in some way, shape, or form. All right, that's how big these are. Right? Remember, we're repeating probably 95% of the song when we use these sorts of repeats. Maybe so, maybe not, but again, big chunks of music. So we have two different instructions that we can put into the music. We can use the abbreviation DC, which stands for da capo, all right, which literally means the head in Italian. Or in English, the translation roughly is the top, meaning we go back to the top, the beginning of the piece of music. So at the very end of the piece, we might see right above the staff, DC, and then something after it. Well, the DC part tells us, go back to the top, go back to the beginning, and start playing a second time, start repeating. We could also see the letters DS, which stands for del segno, all right, which literally translates into the sign. So in this case, we would go back and look for the del segno symbol, which is that funny S with kind of like a weird percent sign laid over it. All right. And we get this symbol, again, sitting on top of the staff, telling us, go back to wherever that symbol was. So hopefully, if you're a studious musician, when you're playing through the first time, you would, oh, good Lord, what is going on with these annoying pop-ups? You would actually note to yourself, hey, listen, I remember seeing that back in measure 16. All right, let me jump back to measure 16 and start playing again. And you might go back to measure 16 or measure 12 or whatever and start playing, and going, all the way down to like measure 65 or 80 or wherever the bottom of the song is. So those are the two instructions. Where do I go back to? Do I go back to the very beginning of the song, or do I go back to the del segno, the symbol, the sign? Now, the second piece of this is, where do I end? How do I end? Where do I stop? So that would be the second piece of information. So I might have a DC or DS, and then I'm going to have an al fine, or I'm going to have an al coda. So it literally would say DS al fine, DS al coda, or DC al fine, or DC al coda. And this tells us how we're going to stop, where the repeating kind of ends. So if we see al fine, all right, that just tells us we go back to the song. We're going to end up, we're going to end our repeat at the end of the song, all right, where we see the word fine. So that someplace in the music above the staff, the song will end, and you will see right above the staff the words F-I-N-E, not fine, fine, all right, with a little Italian inflection. Or the other way would be to have what's called a coda. And a coda literally translates into tail in Italian, which is a little odd, but it means that we're going to have a small section at the end of the piece that is going to be separate from the main piece itself. And that coda section is our ending. So we would repeat back to wherever we go, DC, DS, whatever the repeating process is, and we would continue to play down until we got to where it says coda. At that point, we would skip all the way down to the bottom of the page or the bottom of the song, and we'd find usually like 4, maybe 8 measures of music separate with the word coda, and that's where we would play, and we would find the end. At the end of the coda section, there'd be a final bar line, and that's how we would know the song would end there. So 2 different ways to end the song. We either go back and end when we get to the section of the piece that has fine, or we go back and we end when we get to the coda section. Now, how do you know when to go to the coda section? Well, the coda section is going to have a symbol, a coda symbol, which you see here. It looks like a little circle with a plus through it. That's the symbol that we'd see above the staff that would tell us, after this measure, jump down to that coda section and start to play that. All right, and this is a seamless transition. We don't play and we stop, look down, and then continue playing. We have to kind of do it. By the way, I'm doing the universal symbol for saxophone here, or flutes or violins or whatever. We're going to jump down to where that section is immediately, without pause, without stopping, and there's no breaks. All right, we want to make it a seamless transition. So again, these are the symbols that we might come across: DC al fine, DC al coda. All right, those would be where we go back to the beginning of the song, right? Because it says da capo, DC. The al fine, we would then end, DC al fine, we'd end where we get to the word fine. DC al coda, we'd find the coda symbol and then jump down. DS al fine, we go back to the del segno sign and we keep playing until we got to fine. And then there's the DS al coda, and this is like kind of like the scavenger hunt version of this, because we're going to go back to the del segno symbol. We're going to play until we see the coda symbol, and then we're going to jump down to the coda section. So you're jumping all over the place, going here, there, everywhere. All right, so a little bit more complicated, but this is how composers would do this, would get us to repeat 30, 40, 50, 60 measures of music. So you say to yourself, well, Mr. Norell, why go through all this trouble? Why have all these crazy symbols, all these crazy Italian words? Why not just rewrite the music? That's a very good point, because if you're using Notion, if you've used Noteflight or any other notation software, you are living in a different world, right? I can take my keyboard and highlight and hit Control Copy or whatever, and Control Paste, and bam, there are 30 measures of music. I could just physically copy the music in like 3 clicks of a mouse and 2 clicks of a keyboard. Yes, you can, but put yourself in the minds of Beethoven, of Mozart, of Bach and others, where we have to now physically rewrite these pieces. And that may not sound so horrible if you're writing for violin or for a piano or a pipe organ. But now imagine if you're writing for a 120-piece orchestra by hand, on paper, with pen or quill, And now you have to do that for everybody's music. There's no photocopy machines. There's no control copy, control paste. You're paying scribes maybe to copy your score out into individual parts for the members of the orchestra. That costs money. That costs a tremendous amount of time. Wouldn't it be a lot easier if you could just use these simple little symbols and get the same effect? I think that is definitely worthwhile. So I would encourage you, if you are using these, if you are in that time period, you certainly want to be encouraged to use these. And that's kind of how these came about, because they save a tremendous amount of time and effort. And many of these composers didn't have a tremendous amount of money or time to do these things. And again, they would be paying scribes and other folks to copy their music for them if they were really rich and successful. And this would make their lives a lot easier and probably save them some money and time, which would be a good thing for them. So that's kind of where they came from. They're still with us today. We use them a lot. They can be somewhat confusing, like I said, which is why we like to point it out. All right, let's talk about tempo markings real quick. So in the beginning of our songs, beginning of this chapter, we mentioned tempo markings briefly. Tempo is the speed of the beats, of the pulse of the music. All right, tempo markings are going to tell us exactly how quickly or slowly our pieces should be played. They are always going to show up at the beginning of our song in the top left corner of our music. Usually, they are a quarter note followed by an equal sign or a half note with an equal sign and then a number. All right, and that is going to tell me to set up my metronome to that number so that I can keep track of the beat and play along with everybody else. I'm just pulling up my metronome here. So there's a variety of metronomes actually available in the Kellenberg App Store that you could use. I have one because I'm a music teacher. I have one on my phone. So what we have here, I'll show you real quick, is my metronome set to 108 beats a minute. That's not 801 beats a minute. And if I hit play, if I were to count these over the next 60 seconds, I would count 108 beats. That's how this works. So if I literally counted 10 seconds worth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So about 19 beats a minute times the last 10 seconds. You stretch that out to 60 beats, 60 minutes, or 60 seconds, I should say. You wind up with about 108. So the metronome is a device that helps us practice. It helps us as composers select and make sure our musicians are going to play our songs at the proper tempo. And as musicians and as conductors, it helps us to make sure we're rehearsing together at the same tempo. Imagine if you were practicing a song incredibly slow, only to find out when you go to rehearsal that it's, 20, 30 beats faster, right? It certainly would be very difficult. So this is a way of just communicating, again, what we want to hear and having a way of putting it down on paper. So what do tempo markings look like? How can we do them? Well, the truth is, before we had metronomes like this, we didn't always have tempo terms. Tempo markings. We had these terms. So sometimes we would use words instead, right? So here's a transcription of the song Thriller by Michael Jackson. You'll notice right there, there's our beats per minute. Quarter note equals 118. And that would be where we would set our metronome and then perform at that tempo. I would play the song for you, but YouTube would then take my video down for copyright infringement. So if you want right now, go Google Michael Jackson's YouTube Thriller, tap your foot to the beat kind of thing, listen to the beat, be-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, right? And you can tap along to it. And then if you fire up your metronome, which I'm going to do right now, I'm doing this kind of the very crude method here, but here's 118. Be-dum, bum, 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 be-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, right? 118. There we go. So that's how a metronome basically works. But we didn't always have metronomes. Metronomes, especially we didn't have cell phone metronomes when I was your age. We had the one that just went click, click with a weight on the end of it. All right. Before technology got to the digital age. So what did we use before we had tempo markings? Well, we used to have words like andante and others that we're going to talk about. Those told us how quickly or slowly to play music, but they're not very precise. In fact, music historians often have argued things like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the third movement, how quickly should that be taken? The fourth movement, especially, I've heard beautiful versions of it where it's taken at one tempo, and then I've heard other versions where I'm like, oh my goodness, and I'm pulling out what little hair I have left because it's way too fast, and you just lose the emotion because the piece is being performed at far too quick of a tempo. So I could go on and on about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and various recordings, but I'll save you the lecture. But the idea is that these tempo markings were great for the time period, but nowadays we're a lot more precise, and it really helps us to all perform a piece of music at the better or at the correct tempo. I personally find tempo marking, the numerical kind, better than just the words, but you have to respect where we come from, and the words have been around for centuries. So we basically have three fast tempos that you could see. Presto, which is very fast. You could actually have prestissimo, which is actually faster than 200 beats a minute. Vivace is translated meaning lively, like vive, right, meaning life in Italian. Allegro, which is lively and fast, which is a fairly common tempo marking for most of our music. The faster pop songs and stuff are allegro. Then our medium tempos, which is where we find most of our pop music, moderato and andante. Our moderato is about 110 to 102, andante about 100 down to about 76. You may say, so, Mr. Norell, if moderato ends at 102 and andante begins at 100, where's 101? The truth is, before time came along and we had these metronomes and things, we did everything in twos. So they didn't dial in 101 beats a minute. Just a kind of a weird thing. But it's just nowadays with this, I can do odd numbers. Right? I can do 119, I can do 120, 121, etc. But back then, with the old weight method on the pendulum, didn't quite wasn't as precise. So that's why they went in twos. And then we have slow tempos. See what I did there? Adagio, 74 to 66 beats a minute. And then we have even slower, largo, 64 down to 40 beats a minute. All right. You can have grave, which is even slower. You might remember that from junior music last year. And there are other tempo terms in here that we're not going to kind of cover. Those are kind of the big 6 or 7 or so. But what about if we want to change tempos during our music? We have ritardandos. We might have accelerandos. All right, so we would abbreviate underneath the word, underneath the staff, we would put RIT to tell the group to gradually slow down over a period of time. That's also kind of a cue if you're in an orchestra or a band or a chorus to watch now the conductor or the director as to exactly how slow you should perform so that we all stay together. And the accelerando is the opposite. ACCEL is what shows up under our staff. And again, that tells us to gradually get faster. Think about, many of you probably have your driver's licenses or recently taking your road test. Put that accelerator down. The car's going to gradually get faster. And that's how we are going to get ourselves to a faster tempo. And then we have a rallentando. Rallentandos are going to be these sudden dramatic drops in tempo where we might be clicking along here and then all of a sudden, bam, we slow down, like almost unexpected, a very dramatic effect. A lot of times we see it at the end of pieces and things like that. We do have other tempo markings that we should be aware of besides accelerandos, ritardandos, and rallentandos. Oftentimes we could see a tempo, and that just means the return to the original tempo, all right? A tempo. It's pronounced a tempo, but if you're from New York, you're going to say a tempo. And then you're going to have the fermata, which it didn't show up where it was supposed to on the PowerPoint there, which is a marking placed over a note or rest. All right, this tells us to hold this note out for longer than its value. So in the example here, you have 2 quarter notes in 4/4 time, which we know from last class is only worth 1 beat. But because of the fermati, being that's the from plural of fermati, we're going to hold and then we're going to go on with our song. So we play, D, C, B, A, G, or I'm just guessing at the pitch here, but you get the idea. And then here's an example here. We have a couple of things happening. We have our vivace maestoso, which is lively and stately, 140 beats a minute to the quarter note. And then we're later in the piece, we're going to have a molto ritardando, a very big slowdown, and then a fermata. And then we're going to return to the original tempo, right? So it would be 140 beats a minute is somewhere around here. Bum, 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 bum. And then we have so this is our tempo. We're going to get to the molto ritardando. 1, 2, 3, 4, fermata. And then back to the original tempo. So that's basically how it works. Very short and sweet there. Some other tempo terms that you might come across: odd tempos we mentioned, adagio, allegro, andante we mentioned, ritornuto, all right, immediately getting slower, ritardando, all right, again, presto, vivace, these are all common terms, just another listing of them there for you. All right, so picking up, continuing on here with dynamic markings. Dynamic markings are those symbols that tell us how loud or soft we should be playing, and those symbols come to us in Italian, because originally taken from Latin, and then many of our musical terms and examples will migrate into the language of Italian. So dynamic markings are typically placed underneath the staff. There are exceptions to this rule, but they are fairly rare. So for our purposes in class, these are the symbols, and they will always be underneath our staff. So it's fairly straightforward. This chart starts with the softest of volume levels at the very top, and then the loudest is down here with the 3 Fs, fortissimo. So we have pianissimo, pianissimo, piano, mezzo piano, mezzo forte, forte, fortissimo, and fortissimo. All right, so those are kind of our dynamic markings. And as you remember from maybe junior music last year, we didn't always have these. So a lot of times we had what were called terrace dynamics, where in the early times, composers would control volume just simply by having a group play or having certain members drop out. You may recall from the Baroque era with the Baroque sonatas and things like that, where we would have the tutti section, right, which is where we had everybody playing at once, and then we'd have certain folks drop out, the concerto grossos and things like that. So those were the kinds of situations where we had what we called terrace dynamics, and terrace dynamics give way to eventually these dynamic symbols, which are what we still use today. We also have gradual changes. So we have the crescendo, which is going to be a gradual increase in our volume, gradually becoming louder, and a decrescendo being the opposite of that, gradually becoming softer. In some places, and some composers prefer to use the word dim to represent a diminuendo. All right, and that also means to gradually play softer. All right, and then messa de voce, all right, which is becoming louder and then softer. We have the two symbols there. And again, these are found underneath the staff. And then finally, one of our last sections here, articulation and bowing. Now, this is where we pay homage to the string musicians in the group, in the course. Your books for years talk about, if you've ever been in the chorus or you've been in the band, you know, you guys and girls have articulations to deal with, or pronunciations if you're in the chorus. But for string instruments, our articulations are a little different, and we'll get to that in a moment. To start with, though, the most basic of articulations that we all kind of see across all three types of ensembles would be things like slurs and legatos, where we are going to basically move our voice and slur up and then slur back down, right? We're going to connect our sound without stopping the air or the bow or whatever is kind of producing the sound. Whereas something like a staccato means we're going to play the note short and detached. And then we have what's known as the fermata, which is that upside down, sideways looking parenthesis with a dot. All right. The fermata is a symbol that just tells us that when we arrive at this note, we're going to hold the sound down. I just showed you a example of that a little earlier in the video. And then typically these things show up in ensemble rehearsals or ensemble music, where we look at the conductor or the director, and then we continue on as he or she started to beat time again. All right, if a fermata were to exist over a rest, it means exactly the same thing. We're going to hold out our silence for however long we're supposed to, based on what the conductor or the director is telling us. And then again, we continue on counting once that fermata had passed. And then for the string folks in the group, our bowing. All right. A down bow is kind of almost looks like a pi symbol from math class, but a little different. The pi symbol there indicating, or the pi-like symbol indicating the bow should be pulled downward in a downward direction from the frog, which is the very top, or at the very bottom to the tip. Right. So we're going to pull that string downward, whereas an up bow is the opposite of a down bow. All right, in this case, we're going to move from tip of the bow to the frog. So if I'm holding my violin here, the tip of my bow and the frog is closest to my hand. The tip would be at the very edge of the. If this was my bow, shame on me, I should have a bow with me. But here's my bow. Here's the tip. Here's the frog. I'm holding it. I'm going to be going up with the string, with the bow, as opposed to a down bow where I'm pulling across from frog to tip. All right, and that is how we would do those sorts of bowings. And there's a specific time and place in music where we would want a string musician to utilize either one of these bows. And you would see this written above the notes to indicate what we should be doing. And you have a great example here there on the page. All right, so that kind of wraps up the chapter. Like I said, this video, a little bit shorter, a little bit more concise, because you have an assessment to do. So just take a brief moment to explain what you're doing with this assessment. So this assessment that you're going to take is going to include everything from the chapter. Right? Your assessment would be everything from day one up until today's videos. Right? We would like you to make sure, or like to make sure that you know and understand some of these very basic concepts, because if you don't, we either have to go back over them a little bit more, maybe get you to come to office hours or whatever, before we can move on, because these serve as the foundation of a lot of what we're going to talk about. So we have everything in this chapter from tempo markings, dynamic markings, articulations and bowing, note value, types of meter, types of time signatures, types of notes, types of rests, the notes of the treble clef staff, the notes of the bass clef staff. So that's a real quick rundown of all basically the major topics that we covered. All right, that test will be open for a 24-hour period where you will have to go on and take the test, and it will be this coming Thursday, sometime this coming Thursday, whether you do it at 8 a.m. when it first gets released, or you do it at 10 o'clock that night, whatever or somewhere in between. And then it'll lock on Friday morning at 8 a.m. So you'll have 24 hours to do this assessment. It is about 24, 25 questions. It is timed. You will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 minutes to do these questions. Now, the questions are multiple choice. So when you hear 25 questions in only 15 minutes, oh my goodness, it's less than a minute a question. It's okay. It's multiple choice. Trust me, if you know the material, you'll have no problem answering these questions. All right. If you have any questions or any problems as you're viewing this, please email me. Let me know. If you're viewing this before office hours, please make it a point to stop by office hours, just so that we can get you caught up and on the same page, answer all your questions, so you can be super successful on the assessment. All right. Thanks so much for watching another week. I look forward to doing this again and seeing many of you in the office hours. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and a great week ahead. Take care.